Max Chandler-Mather, welcome to 7:30.
Thanks for having me.
Now, the government compromised putting up $2 billion of new money for housing. Wasn't that the moment for you to compromise and pass the long-term bill?
Well, we made 2 points to the government. Firstly, they weren't spending any money directly right now on building public and affordable housing. Obviously, we've been able to secure $2 billion. But our other point is you can't ignore the 1/3 of this country who rents. And there's a very specific reason. The RBA says rents are going to go up even faster than they did over the last 12 months. And unlimited rent increases will see more and more people evicted out of their homes because they can't afford the private rent and join the queues for social housing, which will basically reduce our chances to zero of actually tackling the housing crisis.
Let's just come back to my question. You didn't compromise on that offer that the government made of $2 billion worth of new money. You didn't compromise on their offer to lift the cap on money coming out of the long-term fund. The Prime Minister says you want the issue, not the outcome. Does he have a point?
Not at all. We halved our offer to the government. We originally proposed $5 billion a year in public and affordable housing and $1.6 billion on the table to coordinate a freeze on rent increases at National Cabinet. We then halved our offer to $2.5 billion.
Did you say coordinated at National Cabinet?
That's right.
There's no rationale here. There's no leader that I'm aware of, no housing minister, no state leader who wants a rent freeze. So just explain what you mean by coordination at National Cabinet.
Well, the Victorian Premier just came out recently and said that he would be open to the idea of caps on rent increases. And look, very clear, maybe you're getting to the difference between a freeze on rent increases and caps. A cap on rent increases is what we want long term, and we're more than willing to negotiate on that. What we also wanted was a temporary freeze on rent.
What's the negotiation when no one says they want a rent freeze?
Well, the Victorian Premier has said that he's open to the idea of a cap on rent increases.
So you accept that the idea of the rental freeze, that policy, that's going nowhere?
No, not at all. Victoria also froze rent increases during the pandemic, as did several other states and territories.
In exceptionally different circumstances.
Of course, but this is why we want the $1 billion on the table to incentivise the freeze on rent increases and ongoing caps, because it would be a brave Premier who went back to their state and said, not only are we going to turn down $1 billion, but we're turning down $1 billion of housing funding because we're so against stopping your rents from going up by an unlimited amount.
I think their argument is they're against a rent freeze that won't do anything to help renters, especially those at the bottom of the market. But let's just stay with the Housing Affordability Fund for the moment. What do you expect is going to change between now and October? What is your strategy?
Well, National Cabinet are meeting right now as a result of Greens' pressure to discuss harmonising renters' rights and tackle rents. And we've said a key part of tackling rents is making unlimited rent increases illegal, because we are getting stories every day, I'm sure lots of MPs across the country are, of private renters copping massive rent increases. I spoke to a pensioner who copped a $200 a week rent increase previously. He told me that if his rent went up by an extra $10 or $20, he'd be on the street. But we do need to deal with that.
I think my question was about the fund, the long-term fund. The government has compromised on that. So what is going to change between now and October? Because there is a point in every negotiation when it becomes clear that there are no more concessions on the table. I think you've reached that point. I mean, isn't it clear? That's the question, that you've reached that point.
No, not at all. Firstly, they haven't really compromised on the fund. They're still only spending up to $500 million.
They have compromised on the fund because they've agreed that the $500 million won't be capped.
Well, no, they said, well, no, that's not true. They said it will be at most $500 million, and that could be changed in the future. And in their words, if there might be seen to be greater need, our argument is there's greater need now. There's a separate $2 billion is not related to the fund. It's happening as a result of Greens' pressure. It's being spent right now.
So isn't that the pivotal moment? So if you're right, you've secured a major concession from the government. Isn't that the moment to compromise on the details of the fund and pass that bill?
No, not at all, because if you do not control unlimited rent increases, this housing crisis will blow over into a major social crisis.
So let's be clear what you're asking for. You accept that rental freezes are not on the table for the state premiers and the state housing ministers?
No, I don't necessarily.
So as far as the Greens are concerned, you are still pushing for rent freezes?
Well, what we've said is we're willing to negotiate with the government. That's obviously our position. But we've also said we're willing to negotiate forms of rent caps. I've been very public about saying that I think unlimited rent increases should be illegal, because you've got single mums out there right now who have to choose between feeding their kids or paying the rent, and one more rent increase will push them over the edge. And what we've said to the government is The ACT has a form of rent caps we'd be willing to look at. They say that rents can't go up by more than inflation in a bit. That would be good as well.
So to understand you, what you're saying is if the government were prepared to have a proper discussion, negotiation on rental caps, not rental freezes, that you would be prepared to pass their bill.
We'd be willing to negotiate on those points. I'm not going to negotiate live on air with you as a mediator, Sarah, but of course we're willing to talk about that, because the bottom line for us is, especially when the government's still only prepared to lock in at most $500 million a year via their Housing Australia Future Fund, which will only be spent from 2024-25, when the government's own body, the National Housing Finance Investment Corporation, a very boring name, has said they say to tackle the housing crisis, we need $15 billion a year.
Yes, they also say that they expect that private investment would, they say that's the quantum amount, but they understand that that money will come from a mix of private money and government money. They're not expecting the government to put all of that money in. But I want to go back to the very important question. Did you speak to any of the state housing ministers before you decided to reject the government's long-term funding bill for social and affordable housing?
Yeah, we wrote a letter
Did you speak to them, was my question?
Well, they didn't get back to us, so we tried. We reached out to them.
Didn't pick up the phone to any of the ministers to tell them what you were about to do?
Well, we took, given that, for instance, we had written a letter outlining our concerns to all the state and territory housing ministers across the country. And by the way, I coordinated that letter with every Greens state and territory housing spokesperson across the country. And that letter laid out those concerns in great detail. They've had that letter for since the start of May. I suppose we'd like to get a response from them, but ultimately it's not up to the Greens or me as the housing spokesperson to coordinate this. Our point is that the Prime Minister, on a national cabinet where 8 of the 9 seats are held by the Labor premiers, First Ministers,
they don't tell the Labor premiers what to do. But let's come back to the coordinate. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to stop you there. In what way does it allow for coordination? Because if the state ministers say they're not going to do something, the Albanese government can't make them do it.
Well, no, that's not true. Again, I would bring you back to the comments made by the Victorian Premier. I'd bring you back to the comments of actually the Queensland Premier as well, who looked at some form of rent control. There's an openness to pursuing caps on rent increases. And just like when the Prime Minister recalled parliaments across the country last year to coordinate caps on energy prices.
It's completely different. I just have to say, just to make it clear to our audience, the gas comparison is not a good one, because there is no question around supply in relation to gas. The question around housing is supply. But I want to come back to the fund, because by your decision to not pass this bill, to side with the opposition, you are delaying shovel-ready projects, you're delaying a pipeline of projects that the states have ready to go. What is your justification for delaying the building of houses for needy people?
Do not accept that. We've got $2 billion right now going out the door, being spent on social and affordable housing.
And there were more projects. There's a pipeline of projects coming through related to the Housing Affordability Future Fund.
Yes.
What is your rationale for rejecting that fund?
To be very clear, we're not rejecting. We've deferred consideration until October 16th. And to be very clear, in the Housing Minister's own words, as written in the letter to the Greens and the crossbench, they can only guarantee the disbursement of $500 million from 2024-25.
Yes, but again, let's slow down and help our audience out here. Whether that money is coming from a future fund or whether that money is coming directly from government investment, the states can go out and borrow money in the market and get those projects moving now. They don't have to wait until the money is yielded from the fund. That they are able to act on that money right now. They could have done so if the bill had passed this week, but you rejected the bill.
Again, I don't accept that. Look
What don't you accept?
I can give you some very practical evidence. So the Queensland government produced a very similar body called the HIF, Housing Investment Future Fund, a very similar model. In March this year, when the Queensland Premier was asked about it, they weren't able to point to a single project that it had funded to completion and build from 2021 to 2023. And one of the points we've made to the government along the way is when there's a shortage of 640,000 social and affordable homes.
There are various versions of that figure. It's a lot of homes, let's agree. Let's not blizzard the audience with numbers.
Yes. Yeah, sure. And we've just proven that the fastest way to build housing is to spend money directly out of the budget, $2 billion that we've secured.
I think the states would disagree with you. They had projects ready based on the funding coming from the fund, but we are getting short of time. So just to summarise, if the government will move on the possibility of rent caps, not rent freezes, you would be prepared to sign the bill?
Fully prepared to look at that, absolutely. Like what we want out of this on October 16th as a plan to limit rent increases and give those 1/3 of this country who rents light at the end of the tunnel, those single mums and pensioners, and lock in a plan that at the very least doesn't see the housing crisis get worse.
Max Chandler-Mather, thank you very much indeed for talking to me.
Thanks for having me.